So if you play modern Yu-Gi-Oh, you're probably familiar with the oppressive negation strategy in the modern day. And while negation strategies are largely hated, we thankfully have some ways to combat these overbearing negations. And one of the main ways we've dealt with this strategy is by using cards like Kaijus. Kaijus have greatly changed up the game by allowing us a viable way to deal with the unbreakable negation boards by tributing your opponent's monsters. And while we've always had things like Lava Golem to tribute away two of your opponent's monsters, Lava Golem greatly restricted your summons, which immensely hindered its competitive viability. However, it did create the blueprint for monsters like Kaijus, which didn't have the same summon limitations like Lava Golem. And it was monumental since they were easy to use and they greatly changed the game, and I would argue they saved Yu-Gi-Oh from an outright negation nightmare. And it's cards like Kaijus that I think saved Yu-Gi-Oh from a potentially terrible future. So if you don't know what Kaijus are, there are these monsters that were inspired mainly by the Godzilla series, and they allow you to typically tribute one of your opponent's monsters so that you could special summon the Kaiju onto their side of the field. And if you happen to have another Kaiju with a different name in your hand, you could special summon that Kaiju onto your side of the field, so long as your opponent has a Kaiju on their field. And this was game changing since Kaijus allowed you to navigate around monster based negation effects, and you could get around the monsters like Apulosa and Red Eye's Dark Dragoon, since tribute summons are not effects and they can't be negated by these monsters. And tribute summons aren't effects at all, they're costs, which means monsters like Dragoon are totally defenseless against something like Kaijus, and this ultimately undermines their whole negation strategy. And the idea behind the tribute strategy is that you would replace the problematic negation monster on the board with one that's far more manageable than the oppressive monster that's responsible for the negates. And this was a viable strategy since most negation strategies were typically carried out by monsters who have negation abilities. And this is how Kaijus thrived, and this is how you got around an oppressive board. And this meant that Kaijus were able to streamline the tribute mechanic in a more accessible way that was accessible to any deck. And cards like Interrupted Kaiju Slumber allowed you to reliably search out these Kaijus so that you could break your opponent's board, and it gave you a greater fighting chance at turning the game around. But you might be wondering, what if they have multiple negates? Things might look more bleak or hopeless if your opponent has multiple negates on the field. If you look at this reality, Kaijus may seem less than ideal, but luckily we have Winged Dragon of Ra Sphere mode. So, Winged Dragon of Ra Sphere mode is basically a Kaiju on steroids, since Sphere mode requires 3 tributes for its summon, which means that you can potentially clear out all of your opponent's negates, or at least most of them. Sphere mode is meant for a bad case scenario where your opponent usually has you boxed in or locked down. You may still have to summon it to your opponent's side of the field, but you greatly disarm your opponent's negations, and you greatly reduce the number of monsters on their side of the field with just one card, which undermines the whole point of their negation strategy. Your opponent just can't negate Sphere mode, and Sphere mode's effect potentially allows you to regain control of it if it survives until the end of your opponent's turn. The main downside to something like Sphere mode is that your opponent has to have at least 3 monsters on their side of the field, so it can be a bit of a brick until they have 3 monsters. It's also not very searchable like Kaijus, and your opponent can potentially use it as XYZ or link material. However, it's a great way to level the playing field, and it can get you out of a really bad situation. But just like Sphere mode, you have cards like Nibiru, which lets you tribute as many of your opponent's monsters as possible after your opponent summons 5 or more monsters during their main phase. This can be devastating for your opponent, especially if they run a spam heavy combo deck. You unfortunately have to give your opponent a powerful token monster whose attack is equal to the combined attack of the attributed monsters, but your opponent does lose a lot of monsters in the process. The other downside is that Nibiru's tribute requirement is an effect. It's a quick effect which can be negated, but you can prevent your opponent from spamming out more monsters, which can be used to make things like Apulosa. And you can also potentially bait out your opponent into wasting their negates, so that you can then use Nibiru's effect to level their playing field. And I would consider Nibiru to be the most competitive, since it is a quick effect that you can use on your opponent's turn and interrupt them in turn. So in relation to the title of this video, why do I think cards like this potentially saved Yu-Gi-Oh? And the main reason I say this is because I imagine a game without cards like Kaijus or Sphere Mode, and I think about how unfair the game would be without these cards. I understand how many people think the game is already unfair, but imagine how impossible fighting these multi-negate boards would be without these cards. This would likely mean that going first would be more important than ever, since it would mean that it would be a race to see who can set up their unbreakable board first. And the person going second would basically have very limited options to break the opponent's board. They would mainly have to rely on things like Super Poly to break boards, which isn't too ideal, and it basically means that the person who went first would win. And if you imagine a world where these cards didn't exist, rogue decks would basically have next to no chance of becoming competitive, since meta decks would be the decks that are far more capable of pumping out these unbreakable boards. Rogue decks clearly don't have the means to make this happen, and they would be completely blown out of the water if these cards didn't exist. They would be completely subjected to these unbreakable boards, and they wouldn't realistically be able to bounce back. And this would mean that the only decks that would potentially be able to retaliate against these unbreakable boards would be the other meta decks, and this would almost definitely turn away current players, and players might actually be quitting in droves because of how unfair the game would be. So it would basically turn the game into who goes first, and they would basically win, and if you go second, you would basically have to scoop almost all the time. And this would be disastrous for rogue players, since they would have to rely on other cards like Dark Ruler No More in order to deal with these unbreakable boards. And I would consider Dark Ruler No More to be an honorable mention on this list. Although it doesn't tribute any monsters, it does negate your opponent's monster's effects, and your opponent's monster can't really retaliate since Dark Ruler No More stops monsters from responding to its activation. And I consider it to be an honorable mention since it does allow you to break your opponent's board, and it's basically the same guiding idea that is present in the idea behind Kaijus. So these have been my thoughts on this topic, and this is why I think these cards have saved the game. They've offered many viable ways to break the opponent's board by not allowing these negation effects to happen, and they give players a way to turn the game around. Furthermore, these tribute cards understand the negation problem since monster cards are usually the cards doing the negation, and by tributing these cards, it uproots the negation strategy. And I immensely appreciate the balance that these cards have attempted to bring to the game. But with that pretty much wraps it up for this video. If you would like to support more content like this in the future, you can do so at my Necromancer 1040 Patreon link down below. I normally post it in the description, and you can check it there along with the other cool things I normally post down below. And with that, thank you so much for watching, thank you so much for your support, and I'll catch you in the next one. Alright, take care.